My name is Emily. I am 32 years old, and I married Mark when I was 28. At the start, everything felt like the dream I always wanted. I grew up in a warm family where my parents taught me to be kind, supportive, and respectful of others. We were never wealthy, but my parents made sure we had enough, and that love filled our home. When I met Mark, I believed I was building a life with someone who understood those values. But I learned quickly that his family was not like mine. His parents, Robert and Linda, carried themselves as if money was the only thing that mattered. They were the type who judged people by their clothes, their jobs, and the cars they drove. At family gatherings, they would make comments about how I wasn't ambitious enough compared to the women Mark's cousins had married. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe I just needed more time to win them over. Still, there was always a coldness between us. I never felt accepted by them, no matter how much I tried. They invited me to dinners but treated me like an outsider. They made big decisions as if I wasn't in the room, and if I voiced my opinion, they brushed it aside. Mark never stood up to them. He would say things like, "That's just how they are," or "Don't take it personally." Even though it hurt, I convinced myself that marriage meant compromise, and I should focus on my relationship with Mark. I believed love would be enough to bridge the gap. But every interaction with Robert and Linda left me with a sense of being smaller, less important, and unwelcome. When I would visit my parents, the difference was like night and day. My parents would welcome Mark warmly. They went out of their way to make him feel like part of the family. My father would include him in projects around the house, and my mother would always cook his favorite meals. They treated him like a son. Sometimes, I wished he noticed the difference and realized how lucky we both were to have people like them in our lives. But if he did notice, he never said it. In the back of my mind, I always knew Robert and Linda's lack of care might one day go beyond hurt feelings. They lived in their own world, where status and money were more important than people. I just didn't expect how cold that world could get until life tested us. And that test came sooner than I ever imagined. It came in a way that shook the ground under my feet and forced me to see exactly who I had married into. The mask of politeness they sometimes wore would come off completely, and what I saw behind it would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and respect. That moment is when everything started to fall apart. It happened on a cold evening when the phone rang and shattered my world. My parents were driving home from a dinner with old friends when a truck lost control on the highway. They didn't make it. The words felt unreal when the officer told me. My body went numb, and I remember dropping the phone. It was as if everything inside me stopped working. In the days that followed, I felt like I was walking through smoke. Nothing made sense. My parents were my anchor, my safe place, and suddenly they were gone forever. I needed strength, I needed people around me who cared, and I needed Mark to hold me together. He stayed by my side at home, but his way of dealing with it was silence. He didn't cry with me, didn't share the grief. He just moved around me like he was waiting for it to be over. When it came time to plan the funeral, I hoped his parents would step in, not to take control, but at least to show up and stand with me. Robert and Linda lived less than an hour away. I called them myself, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. I will never forget the pause on the other end of the line, followed by Linda's flat tone. She said they were so sorry for my loss, but couldn't attend because they had a golf tournament that weekend and a charity dinner the night before. She told me it would be too much to cancel their plans. I stood there holding the phone, staring at the wall, trying to process if I had heard her correctly. My parents were dead. Their daughter-in-law, their son's wife, was burying her family, and their reason for not being there was golf and social events. My heart cracked even further. I turned to Mark, hoping he would at least be angry with them, hoping he would defend me. Instead, he shrugged and said, "You know how busy they are. Don't expect too much." Those words cut me in a way I can't explain. The man who promised to be my partner in life had no fight in him when I needed it most. The funeral day arrived. The church was full of friends, neighbors, and extended family. People came from out of state to pay their respects. But the seats where Mark's family should have been were empty. Every time I looked at those empty rows, a fresh wave of humiliation washed over me. People whispered, asking where my husband's parents were, and I had no answer that didn't sound pathetic. I stood by the caskets of my mother and father, trying to say goodbye, and all I could think about was how alone I felt. Their absence screamed louder than any words. My parents had welcomed Mark's family with open arms, but when it was time to return even the smallest gesture of respect, they couldn't be bothered. That was the moment I realized something inside me had broken. A few months had passed since I buried my parents. I was still living in a haze of grief, trying to piece together what life looked like without them. Most days, I woke up feeling empty, but I pushed through, telling myself time would heal something that felt unhealable. One evening, Robert and Linda invited us over for dinner. I thought maybe they wanted to finally reach out, maybe check on me, maybe try to bridge the distance they had created. I held on to that small hope as Mark and I drove over. Their house was warm and full of light, the table set with fine dishes and wine glasses, but there was no sense of comfort in it for me. We sat down, and the meal began as usual with polite conversation. Robert bragged about his business contacts, Linda went on about her social events, and Mark listened, nodding along. I tried to stay quiet, telling myself not to expect anything. Then, halfway through the evening, Robert cleared his throat and looked at me in a way that made me uneasy. "Emily," he said, "we've been thinking. Ethan's wedding is coming up fast, and it's going to be a grand one. You know how important appearances are. We'll need about $60,000 more to make it the event it deserves to be." At first, I thought I misheard him. I put my fork down slowly, staring at his face to see if he was joking. But he wasn't. He was serious. Linda leaned forward, smiling as if they were discussing something casual, like asking me to bring a dish to a picnic. "We figured," she continued, "since your family is gone now, you don't really have obligations there anymore. You can focus more on our side. It only makes sense you'd want to support Ethan's big day." My chest tightened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had lost everything, and instead of offering comfort, they were treating me like a bank account. They weren't just ignoring my pain. They were using it as a reason to demand money. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to speak up, to tell them how heartless that sounded. But he kept his eyes down on his plate, silent as ever. My throat burned, but I forced myself to stay composed. I asked calmly, "Why me? Why would you expect me to pay that much for your son's wedding?" Robert shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're part of this family. You've been doing well since your inheritance, and Ethan deserves the best. This will be a reflection on all of us." Their words hit me like cold water. They weren't asking, they were expecting. In their minds, I was just a source of money, nothing more. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief swirling inside me, but I stayed quiet, holding it in. That night, as I left their house, one thing was clear. Whatever humanity I hoped they had, it wasn't there. They had shown me exactly who they were. And I knew then that I couldn't let this go unanswered. I sat at their table, staring at Robert and Linda, trying to control the storm inside me. Their words about me paying for Ethan's wedding still echoed in my head. I could no longer stay silent. My voice shook a little, but I managed to say, "You didn't even come to my parents' funeral, and now you're asking me for money for a wedding?" For a moment, the room went quiet. I thought maybe they would feel some shame, maybe realize how cruel they sounded. But Linda just leaned back in her chair and gave a little laugh. "Emily," she said, almost like she was talking to a child, "that was your family, not ours. It wasn't our place to be there." Her words cut deeper than anything I had felt before. My parents had welcomed them with kindness, had treated Mark like their own son, and yet they dismissed their deaths as if they meant nothing. My chest felt heavy, and I wanted to scream, but instead I looked at Mark. I needed him to stand up for me, to say something, anything. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. He didn't defend me, didn't call out his mother's cruelty. His silence told me everything I had been afraid to admit. He would never choose me over them. I felt the air leave my lungs. In that instant, I understood the truth. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my parents. I was also grieving the loss of the partner I thought I had. My husband was right there beside me, but I had never felt more alone. The rest of the dinner blurred together. I barely tasted the food. Linda kept talking about flower arrangements and venues, as if nothing had happened. Robert poured himself more wine and nodded along. I sat frozen, listening but not really hearing, my mind spinning with anger and betrayal. I replayed every moment in my head. Their absence at the funeral, their smug smiles tonight, their cold reasoning that I no longer had obligations because my family was gone. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a wallet, a resource to be tapped whenever they wanted. On the drive home, Mark finally spoke. He said, "You shouldn't bring up the funeral like that. It only makes things more uncomfortable." His words made me grip the door handle so tight my knuckles went white. He was worried about their comfort, not mine. That was the night something inside me hardened. I stopped waiting for him to defend me. I stopped hoping his parents would ever change. The betrayal was complete, and all that was left in me was the sharp edge of anger. I knew I couldn't stay powerless forever. I didn't say it out loud yet, but a quiet promise formed in my heart. One day, they would regret every single way they had dismissed me. And when the moment came, they would learn what it felt like to lose something they cared about. I knew arguing with them would only end with more insults and more silence from Mark. They had shown me who they were, and he had shown me what he was willing to allow. So instead of fighting, I forced myself to smile. I told Robert and Linda I would do what I could to help with the wedding. My words seemed to relax them, and they quickly moved on to talking about Ethan's bachelor party and Samantha's dream of a fairy tale ceremony. On the outside, I acted calm and agreeable. But inside, something different was happening. I realized that if I kept confronting them directly, I would always walk away feeling smaller. I needed to change my approach. I needed to turn their greed into a trap. That night, when we got home, Mark thanked me for keeping the peace. I nodded and said nothing, but my mind was already working. I began to pay close attention to every conversation, every little comment that revealed just how much they cared about appearances and how little they cared about me. The next time we visited them, Linda handed me a list of expenses she said I should cover: flowers, catering deposits, even the band. She spoke like it was already settled, like my role was simply to pay. I tucked the list into my purse and nodded as if it was no problem at all. When I got home, I laid it on the table and wrote down every detail. That was the start of my record. Day after day, I added to it. Every insult, every dismissive remark, every demand for money went onto those pages. When Robert told me it was time to step up and prove I was committed to the family, I wrote it down. When Linda said I should be grateful to have a role in something so important, I wrote it down. And when Mark brushed off my feelings with, "Just do it, it'll make things easier," I wrote that down too. The more I wrote, the clearer things became. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. They wanted me to fund their image, to make their family look grand and powerful while I faded into the background. But I wasn't fading. I was preparing. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. On the surface, I played the part of the cooperative daughter-in-law, agreeing to things I had no intention of following through on. Every smile I gave them was a cover for the storm I was building inside. They thought they were winning, that I was falling into line. What they didn't know was that I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to fight them head-on anymore. I was going to let their own arrogance destroy them, and I would be ready when it happened. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back the power they had stolen from me. And I promised myself I wouldn't stop until I saw it through. The weeks leading up to Ethan and Samantha's wedding became a constant stream of demands. Robert and Linda acted like planners more than parents, except they weren't paying for any of it. They would call me at all hours, sending lists of things they expected me to handle. One day it was the flowers, the next it was the catering deposit, then the rehearsal dinner. Each request came with the same assumption, that I would pay without question. Ethan and Samantha joined in quickly. They stopped treating me like a family member and started speaking to me like I was a service provider. Samantha once handed me a binder of her dream wedding ideas, pointing at page after page of expensive details. "Since you're helping, you should make sure it's done right," she said casually, as if my role was nothing more than writing checks. Ethan backed her up, saying, "This day has to be perfect. Everyone's expecting it." I nodded, smiled, and agreed, pretending to go along with it all. I kept my tone soft, my face calm. To them, I looked like the obedient sister-in-law willing to give up everything for their big moment. Inside, though, my patience was running on steel. Every list, every demand, every careless word was more fuel for what I was building. At one point, Linda even told me, "You should be proud to invest in this. It's going to be the event of the year." She said it as if I was buying stock in their social standing, instead of being drained for their benefit. I bit my tongue and answered with a polite, "Of course." Behind closed doors, I recorded everything. The binder, the receipts they handed me, the smug comments. I kept it all neatly stacked away. Mark didn't ask questions, too wrapped up in his family's excitement to notice what I was doing. If he thought about me at all, it was only to tell me not to cause stress during the planning. Each visit to Robert and Linda's house became like a performance. I played the quiet supporter while watching them boast about how perfect the wedding would be. They told friends that Ethan and Samantha didn't have to worry about a thing because the family was taking care of it. They left out the fact that, to them, I wasn't family. I was just the wallet. It was almost surreal how blind they were to what I was really doing. They were too wrapped up in their own image to notice that I had no intention of saving their wedding. Every agreement I gave was another step closer to their downfall. The more they pushed, the calmer I became. They thought they were draining me, but I was letting them dig their own hole, deeper and deeper with every entitled request. What they didn't know was that soon, everything they had built on my back would collapse in front of everyone they wanted to impress. And I would be standing right there to watch. As the wedding day drew closer, Robert and Linda became more impatient about the money. They wanted to be sure I was going to come through with the big payment that would tie everything together. I had listened to their constant reminders for weeks, and finally, I gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. I told them I would wire the full $60,000 2 days before the wedding. I said it with a steady voice, making it sound certain. Their faces lit up instantly, and for the first time, they treated me with warmth. Linda even squeezed my hand and said, "You have no idea how much this means to the family." Robert added, "You're proving you're truly one of us." I smiled and nodded, though inside I felt nothing but disgust. After that, they started bragging. At dinners, at church, even to their neighbors, they let it slip that Ethan's wedding was being taken care of. They made it sound like the family was so well off, so generous, that money wasn't even a concern. What they didn't say, but what everyone assumed, was that Robert and Linda were paying for it. The image they wanted so badly was now being built on a lie. Meanwhile, I quietly put my own plan into motion. My parents had left me more than memories. They had saved for my future, setting aside money in accounts I had barely touched. Now, I decided it was time to protect that legacy. With the help of a lawyer, I moved the funds into a trust account, one that couldn't be reached by Mark or his family. It was secure, locked away, and safe from anyone who thought they could take it. When the paperwork was done, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like I was standing on solid ground again. Their love was still protecting me, even after they were gone. Back at Robert and Linda's house, the talk of the wedding grew louder every day. Samantha fussed over her dress fittings, Ethan bragged about the guest list, and Linda made speeches about how the wedding would prove their family's standing. Robert went so far as to say, "People will talk about this day for years." I smiled politely, hiding the thought that he was right, but not in the way he imagined. Mark noticed none of this. He was too busy playing the role of the supportive brother, nodding along to every word his parents said. If he had any doubt about the burden being placed on me, he never showed it. I stopped expecting him to. I had made my choice. I would let them believe the money was coming, let them build their pride higher and higher, and let them brag until their voices were hoarse. Because when the day arrived, all of it, the lies, the arrogance, the greed, would come crashing down. And I would be ready to watch them fall. The morning of the wedding arrived with bright skies and perfect weather. It should have been a beautiful day, the kind people dream about. Robert and Linda bustled around the venue, greeting guests and showing off the grand decorations as if it was all their doing. Ethan and Samantha were glowing, dressed in the finest clothes, certain their big day would be flawless. I kept my smile fixed, quiet in the corner, waiting for the moment I had planned for so long. As the vendors began arriving, I saw the looks of expectation on their faces. The florist carried in bouquets, the caterers rolled in trays of food, and the band began setting up their equipment. Each one of them eventually came to me, the person in charge, asking about the final payments. When the first vendor approached, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of contracts and notes, each one showing Robert and Linda's signatures, promising full responsibility for the bills. I handed it over calmly and said, "You'll need to speak with them." They agreed to cover everything. Confusion flickered across the vendor's face. Soon, that confusion turned to frustration, as one after another realized they weren't getting what they had been promised. The florist refused to place another flower until she was paid. The caterers announced they wouldn't serve a single plate unless the balance was cleared. The band stopped their sound check, packing up their instruments. Within an hour, the entire event started unraveling. Guests began whispering as they noticed workers storming out with boxes and trays. The lavish decorations that had been half finished were abandoned. Tables stood bare, the air filled with tension instead of celebration. Robert's face turned red as he pulled me aside, hissing, "What are you doing? You were supposed to pay today." His voice cracked with panic. I looked at him steadily and said, "No, Robert. You told them you would pay. And I made sure they all had proof." Linda rushed over, her voice sharp and desperate. "You're ruining everything." But the truth was, they had ruined themselves. Their lies had built the image they were so desperate to show, and now that image was collapsing in front of every guest. Ethan and Samantha's smiles turned into angry glares as they realized their perfect wedding was slipping away. The guests, dressed in their best clothes, began talking loudly, questioning why the family hadn't handled their responsibilities. Every whisper was another crack in Robert and Linda's carefully crafted reputation. I stood there, silent but steady, as the chaos grew louder. Plates clattered, people shouted, and the decorations were carried back out of the hall. What was supposed to be the proudest day of their lives had become a public disaster. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. They had tried to use me, to strip me of everything I had left, but instead, they had been exposed in front of the very people they wanted to impress. Their greed had written the script, and I had only let the curtain rise. The chaos of the wedding didn't fade quietly. Word spread quickly among the guests, and by the end of the day, everyone knew Robert and Linda had promised to pay but never followed through. Their reputation, the very thing they valued most, was left in ruins. People whispered as they left the venue, shaking their heads at the spectacle they had just witnessed. Robert tried to save face by making excuses, saying there had been a misunderstanding with the payments. But no one believed him. The vendors were furious, waving around the contracts with his signature. Linda tried to smooth things over with fake smiles, but even her friends avoided her, unwilling to be tied to such public humiliation. The couple who once prided themselves on status and respectability now stood exposed as liars. Ethan and Samantha, dressed in their expensive outfits but surrounded by chaos instead of celebration, were livid. Samantha's voice echoed through the hall as she shouted at Robert and Linda. "You ruined everything. This was supposed to be perfect." Ethan joined in, blaming them for turning the most important day of his life into a disaster. The perfect image they had tried to build for him crumbled right in front of his eyes, and he had no one to blame but his parents. For the first time, the family wasn't united. They turned on each other, loud enough for every remaining guest to hear. Years of pretending to be the perfect family shattered in one afternoon, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. Later that evening, when we finally returned home, Mark exploded. His face was red, his voice sharp, as he screamed at me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You embarrassed my entire family in front of everyone." He paced back and forth, his words cutting through the air, filled with anger but not a shred of understanding for what I had been through. I sat on the couch, calm in a way I hadn't been before. His shouting didn't shake me this time. I let him rant, and when he finally stopped, I looked at him and spoke clearly. A husband who watches his wife get treated like trash and does nothing isn't a husband at all. You stood by them while they used me, humiliated me, and tried to strip me of everything. You may be angry now, but the truth is, you lost me long before today. He didn't know how to respond. His mouth opened, then closed, and for once he had no defense. The silence between us said everything that needed to be said. The wedding had collapsed, the family's reputation was in ashes, and my marriage was standing on broken ground. But unlike them, I didn't feel destroyed. I felt stronger, clearer. Their humiliation wasn't mine, it was theirs alone. And I knew this was only the beginning of the ending they had brought on themselves. The days after the wedding felt strangely calm for me, though for Robert and Linda it was the opposite. Their names were dragged through every corner of the community. People they had once tried to impress now looked at them with pity or disgust. Vendors demanded payment, threatening lawsuits. Friends stopped calling, and even their neighbors avoided them. The image they had spent their lives polishing was gone. Ethan and Samantha barely spoke to them. The wedding disaster created a wedge that couldn't be fixed. Samantha refused to forgive, calling them selfish and irresponsible. Ethan, humiliated in front of everyone he knew, pulled away from his parents, blaming them for the mess. The family that once bragged about unity was crumbling piece by piece. For me, the choice was clear. I couldn't live another day tied to Mark or his family. The man who had promised to love and protect me had only stood by while I was treated like nothing. I hired a lawyer and began the divorce process. Every paper I signed felt like a weight being lifted. My parents had left me a gift not just in money but in security, and now that trust was safe from him and his family. They couldn't touch what my parents had worked so hard to protect. Mark tried to argue at first, claiming I was overreacting. But when he saw I wasn't bending, his fight weakened. He realized there was nothing left to take from me, no control he could hold over me. The silence between us grew until it felt like we were strangers living under the same roof. By the time the divorce was finalized, I no longer felt sadness, only relief. Robert and Linda, meanwhile, tried to recover from the humiliation of the wedding. They borrowed money to pay off angry vendors, sold valuables to cover debts, and struggled to keep up the appearance of wealth. But no matter what they did, the stain of that day never faded. They had spent years caring only about their image, and in the end, it was the very thing that destroyed them. I stepped away from all of it. The chaos, the shouting, the endless demands, it no longer belonged to me. I moved into a small house on my own, one my parents had helped me plan for years ago. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long while I felt safe. When I look back now, I think about the moment they skipped my parents' funeral. That was the first sign of who they truly were. But in the end, I buried more than just my parents. I buried the toxic ties that had chained me down. Walking away wasn't just an ending. It was the real beginning of my life. A life where I carried my parents' love with me, but none of the weight of people who never deserved to be called family.